Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle and this is the countdown to World Book Day. World Book Day is on Thursday, April the 23rd, and I am super excited. So excited that I felt like I needed to do a countdown to World Book Day. And for today, we are going to highlight Cervantes. World Book Day is on the 23rd of April, partly because that is the day that Cervantes died. Miguel de Cervantes, he wrote Don Quixote. His full name is Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, and he wrote Don Quixote. Part 1 was published in 1605. And I have this great edition here from 1954, and it has been translated by Walter Starkey. And so I wanted to read to you from his introduction to Don Quixote. Out of a spirit of fin de siècle melancholy sprang Don Quixote, the first modern novel in the world, created out of a life of disillusion, privation, and poverty by a maimed ex-soldier, survivor of a glorious Spanish victory, whose noble nature and gentle sense of humorous tolerance taught him that life is an unending dialogue between a knight of the spirit who is forever striving to soar aloft, and a squire who clings to his master and strives with might and main to keep his feet firmly planted on the ground. And now it's confession time. This is a super famous novel. I have not read it in full yet, but I do know the story, and this is where the confession comes in. I know the story of Don Quixote primarily from the musical, specifically the musical Man of La Mancha, specifically the 1972 version with Peter O'Toole. So that's how I know most of this story, and I think most people have an idea of the story of Don Quixote from musicals or movies, because it is a huge book. It is over 1,000 pages. But it is a great story, and I'm going to read to you from the prologue. Idle reader, you need no oath of mine to convince you that I wish this book, the child of my brain, were the handsomest, the liveliest, and the wisest that could be conceived. But I could not violate nature's ordinance whereby like engenders like. And so, what could my sterile and uncouth genius beget but the tale of a dry, shriveled, whimsical offspring, full of odd fancies such as never entered another's brain? Just what might be begotten in a prison, where every discomfort is lodged and every dismal noise has its dwelling. Repose, a quiet corner, fragrant fields, cloudless skies, murmuring brooks, spiritual calm. All contribute their share in making the most barren of muses teem and bring forth to the world such offspring as will fill it with wonder and delight. And if a father should happen to sire an ugly, ill-favored child, the love he bears it claps a bandage over his eyes and so blinds him to its faults that he reckons them as talents and graces and cites them to his friends as examples of wit and elegance. But I, who appear to be Don Quixote's father, am in reality his stepfather, and do not intend to follow the usual custom, nor to beg you, almost with tears in my eyes, as others do, dearest reader, to pardon or dissemble the faults you may see in this child of mine. You are no kinsman or friend of his. Your soul is in your own body, and you are as much at home in your own house and master thereof as the king is over his taxes. Moreover, you know the old saying, under my cloak, a fig for the king, all of which exempts and frees you from every respect and obligation. So you may say that you please about what you please about this story without fear of being backbitten for a bad opinion or rewarded for a good one. So Don Quixote is a epic adventure story about a man who is still trying to live by the rules of chivalry. He is a knight who is in love with a lady called Dulcinea. He has a squire called Sancho Panza, and their adventures fill this book. I love the first line of chapter 1. At a village of La Mancha, whose name I do not wish to remember, there lived a little while ago one of those gentlemen who are wont to keep a lance in the rack, an old buckler, a lean horse, and a swift greyhound. Now, like Shakespeare, there are some things from this book that have made their way into our everyday language. And one of those things is the phrase tilting at windmills. Now, tilting is a word that comes out of the old jousting tradition in the era of the knights. They would have their jousting tournaments, and so the word tilting is connected to that. But where do we get the phrase tilting at windmills? It has come to mean, it has come to mean like doing the impossible, or, trying to accomplish unrealistic things. So I thought that I would read to you a little bit of the part of this story where that phrase comes from. It's from chapter 8. Of the valiant Don Quixote's success in the terrifying and never before imagined adventure of the Windmills, with other events worthy of happy remembrance. Just then they came in sight of 30 or 40 windmills that rise from that plain, and no sooner did Don Quixote see them than he said to his squire, "Fortune is guiding our affairs better than we ourselves could have wished. Do you see over yonder, friend Sancho, 30 or 40 hulking giants? I intend to do battle with them and slay them. With their spoils we shall begin to be rich, for this is a righteous war, and the removal of so foul a brood from off the face of the earth is a service God will bless." "What giants?" asked Sancho Panza. "Those you see over there," replied his master, "with their long arms. Some of them have them well nigh 2 leagues in length." "Take care, sir," cried Sancho. "Those over there are not giants, but windmills. And those things that seem to be arms are their sails, which when they are whirled around by the wind, turn the millstone." "It is clear," replied Don Quixote, "that you are not experienced in adventures. Those are giants, and if you are afraid, turn aside and pray whilst I enter into fierce and unequal battle with them." Uttering these words, he clapped spurs to Rozinante, his steed, without heeding the cries of his squire Sancho, who warned him that he was not going to attack giants, but windmills. But so convinced was he that they were giants that he neither heard his squire's shouts, nor did he notice what they were, though he was very near them. Instead, he rushed on, shouting in a loud voice, "Fly not, cowards and vile caitiffs! Fly not, but cowards and vile caitiffs! One knight alone attacks you!" At that moment a slight breeze arose, and the great sails began to move. When Don Quixote saw this, he shouted again, "Although you flourish more arms than the giant Briareus, you shall pay for it!" Saying this, and commending himself most devoutly to his lady Dulcinea, whom he begged to help him in his peril, he covered himself with his buckler, couched his lance, charged at Rozinante's full gallop, and rammed the first mill in his way. He ran his lance into the sail, but the wind twisted it with such violence that it shivered the lance in pieces and dragged both rider and horse after it, rolling them over and over on the ground, sorely damaged. Sancho Panza rushed up to his assistance as fast as his ass could gallop, and when he reached the knight, he found that he was unable to move. Such was the blow that Rozinante had given him in the fall. "God help us!" cried Sancho. "Did I not tell you, sir, to mind what you were doing? For those were only windmills. Nobody could have mistaken them unless he had windmills in his brain." "Hold your peace, good Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "The affairs of war are, above all others, subject to continual change. Moreover, I am convinced, and that is the truth, that the magician Freston, the one who robbed me of my study and books, has changed those giants into windmills to deprive me of the glory of victory. Such is the enmity he bears against me. But in the end his evil arts will be of little avail against my doughty sword." God settle it in his own way, cried Sancho, as he helped his master to rise and remount Rocinante, who was well nigh disjointed by his fall. They conversed about the recent adventure as they followed the road toward the pass of La Piche, for there, Don Quixote said, they could not fail to find many and various adventures, seeing that it was a much frequented spot. Nevertheless, he was very downcast at the loss of his lance, and in mentioning it to a squire, he said, I remember having read of a Spanish knight called Diego Perez de Vargas, who, when he broke his sword in a battle, tore off a huge branch from an oak, and with it did such deeds of prowess that day, and pounded so many Moors that he earned the name of Machuca, I think. And so he and his descendants were called from that day onwards Vargas ya Machuca. I mention this because I intend to tear from the very first oak tree we meet such a branch, with which I am resolved to perform such deeds that you will consider yourself fortunate to witness, exploits that men will scarcely credit. God's will be done, said Sancho. I'll believe all your worship says, but straighten yourself a bit in the saddle, for you seem to be leaning over on one side, which must be from the bruises you received in your fall. That is true, replied Don Quixote, and if I do not complain, it is because knights errant must never complain of any wound, even though their guts are protruding from them. If that be so, I've no more to say, answered Sancho, but God knows I'll be glad to hear you complain when anything hurts you. As for myself, I'll never fail to complain at the smallest twinge, unless this business of not complaining applies also to squires. Don Quixote could not help laughing at the simplicity of his squire, and told him that he might complain whenever he pleased, and to his heart's content, for he had never read anything to the contrary in the order of chivalry. Sancho then bade his master consider that it was now time to eat, but the latter told him to eat whenever he fancied. As for himself, he had no appetite at the moment. Sancho no sooner had obtained leave than he settled himself as comfortably as he could upon his ass, and taking out of his saddlebag some of the contents, he jogged behind his master, munching deliberately. And every now and then he would take a stiff pull at the wineskin with such gusto that the rudest tapster in Malaga would have envied him. While he rode on, swilling away in that manner, he did not remember any promise his master might have made to him, and so far from thinking it a labor, he thought it a life of ease to go roaming in quest of adventures, no matter how perilous they might be. So, tilting at windmills. There's another word that we get from this book that we use in everyday language, and that's quixotic. And that just means exceedingly idealistic. So if you ever hear someone using that word, quixotic, we get it from this book, Don Quixote. So this has been the countdown to World Book Day, and I will see you again tomorrow for another countdown video. Bye.